Hi there. This video is an exposition of the game Conquest of the Pacific. It was this video was conceived in response to a reply to a comment I left on Tim Corchoy's wargaming YouTube channel, and he is a great fan of strategic Pacific theatre war games, and is always on the lookout for that fast playing. I mean, he loves the bigger ones, I understand, but he's also looking for the kind of a fast playing, simple but satisfying PTO war game. And I suggested this game to him, and he took a quick look at it on Board Game Geek and said, Axis and Allies isn't really my thing. And I said, well, it's not really Axis and Allies, so I feel kind of duty bound now to explain that a bit more, and I'll do it, let the game speak for itself via my sort of translation, my exposition of what it is. So first I'll speak about the components, and what you get in the game is this map. It's I've got it under Perspex. It's actually sort of very thick paper. I've probably folded it and unfolded it, sort of 10 or 12 times, and it's already got a few splits along the folds, unless they were already there to start with. Actually, I think looking at it now, they were already there to start with, where they have sort of some gaps there at the two crucial folds. It's a nice map. And you don't really need Perspex. It's quite thick paper, but it's quite glossy, so even having Perspex won't add any more glare. I considered doing it without Perspex so I could have lights on, but there was glare anyway. So you get the map. Let's have a bit of a closer look at it. Okay, you can see the graphics, they're computer generated graphics. The game was produced in 2002. I think that's the first edition. There was a second edition. There's still some available from Conquest Gaming LLC on their website for $10, or you can get it for sort of comparative prices, although actually some are second-hand for actually more. The second-hand sellers don't seem to have caught up with the reduction in the main price. It was originally sold for I think $30, but you got the Aleutians up there. You see even Alaska, it counts. You got the Kuril Islands there. We go as far as Borneo, as far down as Australia. Guadalcanal's right at the bottom here. Samoan Islands here. The Hawaiians there, and the rest. So you get the board, you get the box, and you get the rule book, which is this, all of 24 pages, and that includes I think 3 pages for example of play, and that is it. The pieces you see on the board you do not get with the game, and that is because it was actually developed. Here, I'll just put the camera down for a sec. It was actually produced as an expansion. It called itself to Axis and Allies. Now that is a bit of a misnomer, but I understand it was playing to the Axis and Allies crowd, because that's a big community, and so I guess the understanding was that's kind of like already a market. There's already a big market there for expansions and variants. I would say this is more of a variant, but the expansion I guess comes in because you need to have an Axis and Allies set to play it, or you would have to make your own, or cull them pieces from somewhere else. So it uses all the standard Axis and Allies pieces. You've got carriers, battleships, destroyers, transports, submarines, fighters, bombers, infantry, tanks, artillery. Then you have air bases, you have shipyards, and those are all represented with the Axis and Allies plastic pieces. Now, because Axis and Allies, the base set, doesn't contain quite enough, say, battleships, or there's another class for Japan, Yamamoto is a battleship in a class of its own. They suggest using a German Axis and Allies unit for it. I'm actually using Axis and Allies pieces that I got second hand in a kind of like a bundle. So there's like different sets all mixed together. So I got different molds and different colours and so forth. And you don't actually get artillery units in Axis and Allies, but you have AA. So you use the AA units as artillery. Although I have some artillery, US artillery obviously came from some other kind of Axis and Allies variant. So those are all the units that are represented. Then you also need some chits. You use the British rondels for pillboxes, which only the Japanese can build, and then you use the nationality markers to indicate which nationality is which. You use the original Axis and Allies. These are very handy to indicate that's 2 units there, and if you have a red piece, that would indicate 5 units, so that would be a total of 6 units there. You also need money, and so I'm not using Axis and Allies money, I'm just using some other money. Obviously you can use poker chits and so forth. And so things are all priced in dollars. I guess that's how it came in Axis and Allies. So for example, infantry cost 3 and carriers cost 18. That's the spread of the costs. Then on Board Game Geek there's some useful, you've got everything you need in the game. So you have the costs, the units, the cost, attack value, defense value and their movement value. And that is all you really need from the game in terms of those sort of basic statistics. You can get a very handy printout from Board Game Geek which lists all of that, including the variants like naval bombardment. Some can do that. Defense is different in mountains, as attacks sometimes different out of mountainous areas. You've got some extra caveats for different units. I've also added to them because play aids are never complete enough for me, and also you can print out your setup sheets, and that's all you need to play the game. So if you have Axis and Allies or Axis and Allies pieces, or you can cover all those different units in a different way, you can play the game quite easily. And how does it play? Well, I really like it, and I have to say that it gives the sense of the Pacific Theatre campaign in I was going to say like broad brushstrokes, but I think it would be better to say in design for effect. So it is using very simple Axis and Allies a system or concepts, but it has certain extra or different things added to it, which makes that basic system fit this actual campaign. Now, so what I'm talking about is that every unit essentially moves 2 of these areas, except for infantry, which can only move 1. On land, you have 2 types of areas. You have the basic landing zones, they're called, which are kind of green for the US, yellow for the Japanese, and orange for neutral ones. And then you have mountainous areas, they are called, and they are in grey, kind of mountainous graphic. Now, the design for effect here is that units can, let's bring it a bit closer to, whoops-a-daisy. So if we look here, say at New Britain, you can see it's got, New Britain itself has 2 zones, and you only have to capture both of those zones to control New Britain. If you do that, then you get the income from New Britain. Now, a unit could be in the landing zone or in the mountain zone. If it's in the mountain zone, it gets defensive bonuses, and the design for effect part of it is that that may not be historically or geographically completely exact. Okay, it's probably quite close here, but it's not a sort of finesse and fine detail. There's no mountainous regions in Hawaii and Pearl Harbor. Oh no, I beg your pardon, there is one in Hawaii itself there. But I think mainly what these things are doing is they are representing certain areas like Guadalcanal. I guess it is geographically based, but it more represents that you can't. It takes a while to conquer all these areas, is what I'm trying to say. And you can't just do it in one turn because, say, for example, this Guadalcanal was empty. You could put down an infantry unit here and here in one turn, but then you would still need another turn to completely to move into the mountainous area. So you can't come from the sea into a mountain area. So it's going to take at least 2 turns to conquer any one place with mountain minimum, which then means that you won't get islands swapping hands too quickly, and you are going to get some of this kind of back and forth and units holding out for a long time, especially then because also the Japanese can put down these pillboxes, which add 1 to their defensive value, and it reduces the effect of naval bombardment. And that's another thing where design for effect comes in the sense that you can naval bombard with any destroyer or battleship. So for example, the battleship here could come into this sea zone and it could naval bombard these infantry, and it could do that turn after turn, and eventually it might kill them all, and then the island would be empty, no longer belong to well, it would still belong to the US, but it would be completely undefended. Now you might say that's completely historically unrealistic. You cannot empty an island just by naval bombardment, but the sense then is that it's not really going to be just naval bombardment. There will be some land forces, so a battleship count is not representing just a battleship. It's also escorting destroyers, maybe marines and so forth like that. And so you have to take the whole picture with a broader brushstroke, and of course you're going to have to do that with a quicker, simpler, fast-playing game of something as complicated as the whole Pacific theatre of operations. And so this design for effect is a key issue, and what I even if going forward I don't explain things very well, what I want to try and convey at least is that despite maybe the simplistic appearance of this coming as it does from the Axis and Allies family, because of the certain designs for effect embedded in this original rule set, I think it works very effectively as a fast-playing complete experience of the PTO theatre. So perhaps if I go through the sequence of play, and then I can explain how things work to give you more of a sense of what's going on. So Japan goes first, and Japan in the first turn they get a special option or special allowance that they can place an airbase on something that they have captured, an island they have captured that turn. Normally you can only build air bases and place units that you have built on something that has been yours for the whole of the turn, not something that you've freshly captured. So that enables, like I put it here on Wake Island on this as a forward airbase. Japan starts with some naval units around here, and America does not have. They have some naval, like destroyers and a battleship unit here and a carrier back here. So you can perform Pearl Harbor. But although strangely there's a transport with those units, there's no infantry with that transport, so you couldn't actually do an invasion and place an airbase straight there. I think that's the most forward place you could, Wake Island being the most forward place from the starting setup, you could place an air base. So Japan goes first, and you start by purchasing your units. Now Japan starts with $20 and the US with $50. So Japan has $20 to purchase units. You could get, say, 2 fighters with that, or 1 carrier and put down 2 pillboxes, or say 4 armour, or infantry costs 3, so that would be 6. Some battleship costs 15, destroyer costs 10, submarines cost 6. So you take your choice. You could maybe build 3 submarines, and you pay for those, and then you put them up beside the map. Then you perform your combat movement. So then you move any units that are going to perform combat that turn. Then the opponent gets to scramble any fighters that, if say, okay, we've got the Hawaiian Islands here, and if, as Japan, I decide to attack Hawaii with these air based on the carrier. A carrier can carry 3 air fighter units, no bombers. Fighters can move 4, so they would go 1, 2, and they would have to be 3, 4, go back at the end of their turn. They could, you could move the carrier later and then land them back on the carrier, but you can't extend their move that way in a kind of a gamey move. Don't worry about those details for now, but be assured that the designers have obviously tested this thoroughly. So say I move my fighters here, then any fighters that are based on the island, they can attack something that is coming in any of the surrounding sea zones. They don't defend on their actual thing. They defend as something comes in. If they are bombers, they will not. They will be attacked on the ground, but they will be able to have a defensive attack. So again, it's saying, so how do bombers on the ground attack fighters coming up? Well, again, it's designed for effect. There must be some that would simulate a few fighters left as protection, maybe some cap for the bombers, although very minimal one. So say as the Japanese, this is my combat move. Then as the US, I get to scramble those fighters into adjacent zone as they come in. That would that attack would go forwards. My intercepting attack would go forwards. If any of the Japanese survived, they would carry on, and then we would go to combat. We would fight the combat out, and that happens in as many rounds as you like until the other side retreats. There's certain instances where there's only 1 round of combat. I think in naval combat there's only 1 round. Okay. Well, anyway, I'm just explaining things in an overall overview. So after combat, 1 or possibly both of you will have retreated. 1 will be left in control of the area, or if it's air, you would have to move back again. Then you do non-combat movement. So then because the battleships, they hadn't joined in, and the carrier, I could then move these 1, 2, and then the air would move back 1, 2, and land back on their fighter, and then I would do other movement like moving this transport back to Japan, etc., etc. So all combat happens before combat movement, and combat happens before non-combat movement. In non-combat movement, your opponent could also scramble fighters. So if I'm just moving past those islands with a transport, they could send out aircraft to intercept it. And again, designed for effect, fighters, they have an attack value of 3 and a defense value of 3. So they are just something representing what you need at that moment, be it dive bombers, actual interceptors or escorts, etc., etc. So it's quite an abstraction, but it works fine for what we want. Then after all the movement and combat and non-combat movement, you will place your new units. So you don't get to move them the turn that you buy them, and then after you place your new units, you calculate your income. So you will get income from places that are recently conquered, that you conquered in that turn. And that's the end of your turn. Then it goes to the United States. They purchase units, they do combat movement. Japan scrambles fighters in defense. They do combat. Retreating aircraft have to be landed, that kind of thing is dealt with. Then US would do non-combat movement. Japan could again scramble fighters. America would place their new units according to the rules and collect their income. Now the rules, the placing units contain some crucial rules, which is essentially ships can only be built at the San Diego Sea Zone here, which is part of the United States, or the Tokyo Sea Zone here for Japan, except that one transport can be built in Brisbane every turn for the US, and also any shipyard can also build a transport once per turn. So like there's a shipyard on Oahu at Pearl Harbor, so you can build a transport there. Otherwise destroyers and battleships and so forth are built in the United States. So again, you're not literally building it, but or maybe you are, but it's also abstracting movement of forces. Then infantry and land units are also built on like the Japanese landing zone, so that is the mainland, not the mountain, and the United States landing zone, plus one per every port owned for the whole turn. So not a port you've just captured. So there's ports in the Philippine Islands, Port Moresby, Rabaul, Pearl Harbor, Port Midway, not at Wake, not at Iwo Jima. So what that then means is you can also, again, you can automatically put an infantry there, Rabaul, Port Moresby, the Philippines, Port Midway, and Guadalcanal. Every turn, provided you build it, also in Nome up in Alaska. So generally the builds happen all here, but transports and infantry can be added in extra places, and again that is great design for effect, in the sense that that's indicating the feeding of these necessary supplies that is always going on below the surface of the game. And again that means that you then can get these protracted fights for these key places, Port Moresby, the New Guinea Islands, Rabaul, Guadalcanal, the Philippines, and so forth, Midway. What else to explain? Yes, and there's another key thing which you don't get in Axis and Allies in the handling of islands and island chains, and that is that an island, some islands have airfields on them, and that is the ones that historically did, and an island, any air unit on the island, it also counts all adjacent sea zones as well, it doesn't count them when it moves. What this essentially means is that you can scramble fighters. For example, from Midway, you could scramble fighters out to the sea zone around Wake Island. You wouldn't be able to land them on Wake Island. That would take another point, and then you could send them back. But what this effectively means is that although the geography has been distorted and that the islands are many of the islands are represented as a lot bigger than they actually are, but combined with the clever design of the sea zones around them, you can get effective interaction between islands in chains and in adjacent chains of islands in terms of how far air power can reach, and yet how long it takes it for a ship to travel through the same area. So air power gets a bigger reach than it might normally have if these islands chains and sort of one smaller non-mainland islands, I think they call them, are treated. So yes, and then as I said, you can build air bases. Air bases can be built so you can extend the reach of your air. And so effectively what this means is that I started a game to remind myself how it plays, and I've just finished the third turn, and you can see Japan, there's no, I'll explain how you win it in just a sec. There's no turn limit, and there's no indication of scale and so forth. You just take it in turns until someone is a winner. So we don't know what year it is or what month it is. We're not worried about that. But in 3 turns, and essentially that's 3 cycles of operations is really all you need to consider. Japan has taken all the Philippines. Now that took a while because they had to move into the mountainous regions. It's taken the Marianas Islands that did not belong to it. It's taken Wake Island, and it's actually taken Midway Island as well. In fact, that's newly conquered, so I give them their thing. Now it's building up. I've sent them far forward to provide bases to try and keep back the American tide as it builds up. The consideration then is, does Japan go for the New Guinea Islands and potentially Australia? And no, it's not all of Australia which you would be gaining, but you might gain a region of Australia. Or does it head more for Pearl Harbor and perhaps even Canada or the United States? Really is not feasible at all. The point being that Japan wins when it reaches an economic level of 40, and that is double what it starts with. At the moment it has 28, so you can see their spread is very large. They've got the Philippines, they don't yet have the New Guinea Islands. If they took New Guinea Islands, and that includes New Britain, that would give them 5 more, which would bring them to 33. And then essentially they would need to take all of Guadalcanal and New Ireland and the islands around the slot there, and perhaps Borneo to win. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. No, they just need all of Guadalcanal, and then they would win. So if they took all of this section, not counting Borneo and Australia, leaving out the Hawaiian Islands, the Hebrides, Samoans, and all of the Americas, they would win the game. And I think that is correct in the sense of giving Japan a possible winning condition. You might say in your mind, well, America would still be able to stop them, but it gives Japan a doable win. And on the other hand, you could say that they had broken the back and of American will to continue, which was, late in the war, flagging. For America to win, for the United States, or all they have to do is obtain a successful bombing hit on the Tokyo landing zone, which is essentially the whole of the non-mountain mainland area of Japan. The 2 Japanese mainland islands have been sort of merged into one for the purposes of this game. So, and that represents the nuclear bombs being dropped and ending the war here in that respect. So I think that's great because it simulates what the US had to do. It had to hit Japan in the heartland in a fashion that would break their will, because you know as we know there was still folks holding out years later, not knowing the war had ended. So America has to take it to the heartland. Japan's not trying to knock out the United States. It's just trying to get a sizable chunk of the Pacific. And whether you consider that realistically the game would continue beyond that, fair enough, but Japan has done its job. I think it would be termed better than historically they did. And so that is it. I don't know what more I can say without going into nitty-gritty details, except that the rules are written fine. They're a little bit strangely in the sense that it starts with it lays the ground, so it gives you a broad stroke of the history of what happens at the start. There are little pictures inside, like of General MacArthur, Zero's photo of the Japanese delegation arriving for surrender on the USS Missouri and so forth. So it's a nice little rule set, and it's written in this style: winning the game. Japan wins when it reaches an income of $40 at the end of the United States turn. The United States wins when it is able to successfully industrial bomb, explains that, in brackets, the Japanese mainland. Of course, either side may wish to concede before these conditions are met. So you don't have, it's not all broken down in cases, but every section, combat, scramble fighters, non-combat movement, everything is needed, and then essentially there's collect income, place new units, then they just delineate every unit and how each unit functions. There's some repetition, so they sort of, in the sense that they mention things necessary in two different places. They mention it in two different places for clarification. And then you escorting, bombardment, and retreating are described. That's all the rules you need. The units: retreating, bombarding, escorting, collecting income, placing new units, non-combat movement, combat, scrambling fighters, combat movement, purchasing units, sequence of play, explanation of the different zones, sea zones, landing zones, mountain zones, winning the game, the setup, and then the tables for setup and the build costs and attack and defense numbers. And then you get 4 example of play describing each of the essential, the combat, the scrambling, non-combat, and other scrambling fighters phase. So how the game actually works. So it's great. I have had no problems with the rules. A little bit, and I still have it now, is grokking how the islands work. Maybe if I read it from here. Carrier islands, that's what they call it. So all landing zones on islands, except the mainland of Japan, the US and Australia, are considered carrier islands. And I think what that means is you kind of consider them in the sense of like they are effectively a carrier in a sea zone. So every sea zone, if you have ships in this zone, to move, the adjacent sea zone is the first one they count, so 1, 2. So for example, the midway is considered a carrier, so every sea zone it is in is part of its sea zone, and the next one is the one that you would start counting for movement. For aircraft movement purposes, the landing zones and all sea zones that are adjacent are considered to be the same space. Note, you cannot use a landing zone to extend the range of aircraft. If you leave the landing zone in a different sea zone than which you entered, it costs 1 movement point. So it's just, you just have to bear that in mind when you play, and it is key, like I said, for affecting the relationships between islands and island chains and the respective sea and air movement and distance capabilities. So I think that is it. That's probably all you need to know. The United States, although it's lost like the Philippines, Wake Island and Midway Island, 1, 2, 5, 6, is still on 45. $45 because it's taken the New Hebrides, and you have interesting decisions right from the start because the US starts with some like a battleship and a transport here, and you have a transport over in Australia, so you can start moving units around right from the start, even as the Japanese are expanding out and taking their initial conquests. So yeah, I'd say it's a great game, and do not let the initial appearance deceive you. It definitely does have that flavour of Axis and Allies in the sense of the simplicity and the using these units and how that is used. But the rules themselves are from that family, but they have enough finesse to them that it is a very different game, and the theatre is confined, so you're not having to worry about how Germany attacks Russia and does Japan. You don't have to worry about all those strangenesses that Axis Allies can give. That's it. I feel like I need to say more, but I can't think of anything more. It's probably enough. Probably the only other thing I could do is do an example of play, and I might do that just in case anyone's interested. That's it then. So Conquest of the Pacific by Conquest Gaming LLC. They are still in business. They've produced a few other games, and I would say they're an interesting little game company.